Senator Eben. Here. Senator Surville. Senator Boysko.
Here.
Delegate Sickles.
Present.
Delegate Delaney.
Here.
Delegate Austin.
Here.
Delegate McClure.
Here.
Walter Alcorn.
Here.
Paul Smedberg. Kate Matisse.
Here.
Secretary Miller.
Here.
I will now open the floor for nominations of chair. Do we have any nominations?
Madam Chair, I move that we nominate Senator Edmund as chair of the SJ 28 Commission.
And I second it, Madam Chair.
Are there any other nominations? I will now close the nominations and we will vote on the nominee. All those in favor of Senator Eben, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. Senator Eben is the chair, and I will turn the meeting over to him.
Thank you. And thank you to the members of this joint subcommittee to study the growing transit needs in Northern Virginia. Our next order of business is to elect a vice chair, and I would like to nominate Delegate Mark Sickles as vice chair. Okay, there's a nomination, a second. Are there other nominations? If not, we'll proceed to vote. All in favor of Mark Sickles as vice chair, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Abstain.
Okay, well, congratulations. Even with that abstention, you're overwhelmingly elected. Our first order of business, before we proceed with the meat of the meeting, is to adopt a virtual participation policy, which members should have before them a draft of. And if there, maybe what we should do is ask counsel if, could you explain the policy, if it, any notable components that are different than other?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The remote policy before you basically allows everything that is allowed under FOIA. It addresses remote participation by individual members as well as all virtual meetings, provides guidelines for such options. Aside from all the normal provisions, as a note, there was an update effective July 1st that allows not only for all virtual meetings, not only just 2 all virtual meetings out of all of the meetings for a given year, but also up to 50%. That is for this case of this subcommittee, will still be 2. So in addition to that, the provisions do not allow for 2 consecutive all virtual meetings.
Okay. Do members have any questions about the draft virtual participation policy? I would entertain a motion to adopt the policy.
Second.
Okay, there's a second and a motion. Okay, all in favor, unless there's discussion, all in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, now that policy is, I'm sorry, it's a roll call vote. So we'll vote on our electronic voting device, or is that a roll call?
I'll do roll call.
Okay, we'll do a roll call on the policy.
Senator Eben.
Aye.
Senator Boysko.
Aye.
Delegate Sickles.
Aye.
Delegate Delaney.
Aye.
Delegate Austin.
Aye.
Delegate McClure.
Aye.
Walter Alcorn.
Aye.
Kate Matisse.
Aye.
Secretary Miller.
I'm going to vote aye, but I'm really not in favor of provision 3. But I'm going to vote aye anyway because I'm a rookie here and people got to come from a long way away. But I understand that the nature of this group, and I think it's really important that we're here together. I'm voting aye.
Ayes 9, no 0.
Okay, the policy.
Servell's present, but I don't think I can vote.
That's right. And my next order of business was to announce that now that we have a virtual participation policy, Senator Scott Surville, who is participating remotely today, is with us virtually. And I believe that Metro Board member Paul Smedberg is planning on joining us remotely as well. I don't know if he's online yet. Before we proceed with business, why don't we have everyone just introduce themselves for those in the audience or at home who might want to know who's on the committee. Secretary Miller, could we start with you, and just feel free to say anything you'd like, but just want folks to know who's here.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Secretary Miller, I reside in Norfolk, Virginia normally, but I've been a secretary since the administration began, and happy to be here to help work on something really important.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm Walter Alcorn. I am here on behalf of the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission as a representative of that group. I also serve on the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors as the, thank you very much. We got to hit the button, don't we? I also serve on the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors as the representative of the Hunter Mill Supervisor District.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am Delegate Terry Alston. I represent the 37th House District, which is to the west, close to Roanoke, Botetourt, Allegheny, Rockbridge, Craig. Happy to be here. I've served on transportation since I've been in the legislature 11 years now. Get great pleasure out of that. I'm passionate about it. I think it has tremendous needs in the Commonwealth. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the privilege to serve with you on this committee.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Sickles. I represent part of Southeast Fairfax County. I'm also on the Council of Governments, the legislative representative from Virginia on the Council of Governments that has the DMV Moves initiative, which is similar to what we are pursuing here, but we'll do jointly and not have any conflicts.
Adam Eben, I represent Alexandria, Arlington, Fairfax, have a number of metro stations in my district, as well as VRE stations and regional bus, so I'm very eager to get my sleeves rolled up and deal with the charge of this commission.
Thank you so much. I'm State Senator Jennifer Boysko. I represent the 38th Senate District, which is McLean, Great Falls, Reston, Herndon, Wolf Trap. I also represent a good portion of the Silver Line and serve on as the chair of transportation in the Senate and on several other regional transportation bodies. Happy to be here.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Delegate Carrie Delaney. I represent the 9th District in the Virginia House of Delegates. That's parts of Chantilly and Centerville, just south of Dulles Airport. I've also served on the Transportation Committee since the year I was elected, but am currently the chair of House Transportation and am honored to be here with you all today on this important issue. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Adele McClure. I represent the 2nd House District, which is parts of Arlington, and I believe that I can claim that I have the most metro stops in my district, and I also serve on the House Transportation Committee.
Good afternoon. I'm Kate Mattice. I'm the Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. I'm excited to be a technical resource to all of you, again, on this very important work. Thank you.
Okay. Now, our next order of business is an overview of Senate Joint Resolution 28 that provides for this.
You want me to introduce myself?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, virtually, Senator Surville.
And I'm Senator Scott Surville. I represent the 34th Senate District. I represent one metro station, I think one VRE station, and I have the most heavily, the highest number of bus users in all of Northern Virginia on the Route 1 corridor, I believe. It's good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know that Paul Smedberg was online but was having some problem with his passcode, so he'll be participating. I don't know if you can, if that's been corrected yet. Paul, speak up if you're there, but otherwise we know you're listening. The next order of business is an overview of Senate Joint Resolution 28, providing for this committee. And I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Kinderman to, is it you or Mr. Edward who's going to explain that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, my name is Stephen Kinderman. I'm a staff attorney with Legislative Services. We just wanted to provide an overview of the resolution creating this body for the subcommittee members and the public to introduce your specific areas of inquiry in the study of growing public transit needs in Northern Virginia. So to begin, SJ 28 was chief patroned by Chairman Eben, and I would know that each of our legislative subcommittee members were co-patrons for that resolution. It was agreed to on March 5th of this year. The resolution begins by kind of contextualizing the issues that this study is going to look into. Basically, we have over 1.5 million people relying on Northern Virginia Transit weekly. We have a lot of sales tax and income tax revenues coming in that's generated from those Nova Transit networks to the general fund. We have a lot of partners and organizations involved that we're very fortunate to work with and are represented here on the subcommittee as well. During COVID, there were a number of concerns for transit systems nationwide, but persistent inflation and ridership reductions coupled with federal aid phasing out has left all transit systems with challenges moving forward. Specific to Virginia, WMATA projects operating budget gaps of $750 million in fiscal year 2025, which could increase to $1.2 billion by fiscal year 35. WMATA's capital program is constrained by the exhaustion of dedicated capital funding bond capacity by fiscal year 29, and the current 3% cap on annual growth in Virginia operating assistance to WMATA has proven useful, but with some unintended consequences. So that leads us to the charge of this joint subcommittee. Facing these circumstances, we've been tasked with studying long-term sustainable dedicated operations and capital funding, cost containment controls and strategies, all with an eye towards ensuring that WMATA, VRE, and the public transit systems that serve NVTC and PRTC transportation districts meet the growing needs of public transit in the Northern Virginia region. As part of that work, the resolution has directed the Joint Subcommittee to establish a technical working group comprised of representatives from across the industry and government. You'll see those representatives on the board, a lot of acronyms, but we've got NVTC, PRTC, VRE, WMATA, DRPT, the Nova Transportation Authority, ATU Local 689, and a representative from the Northern Virginia business community. The technical working group is directed to examine the 10 revenue sources identified in NVTC's Metro Operating Funding and Reform Working Group report. That includes among those 10 revenue sources, they looked at the retail sales and use tax, transient occupancy tax, grantors tax, regional motor vehicle fuel tax, motor vehicle sales tax, vehicle registration fees, and driver's license fees. They also looked at 3 revenue sources that currently do not exist in Virginia. That would be the Transportation Network Company sales tax, parking sales tax, and auto repair labor tax. Further, the technical working group is tasked with proposing 5 additional sources of dedicated revenue for new operating and capital funding that leverages and supplements existing state and local funding commitments for Nova Transit agencies, and more generally, examining industry-wide cost savings and containment tools. The resolution also provides that to the extent feasible, the technical working group will also review future land use plans for high-capacity transit corridors in Northern Virginia to support transit ridership growth, telework impacts on regional transit ridership, appropriate local bus service usage, long-term capital funding needs at WMATA, capital funding prioritization processes, and governance and structural issues contributing to funding instability at WMATA, Virginia's appropriate share of jurisdictional subsidies based on existing Metro rail stations and Metro bus stops, findings of the NVTC's Metro Operating Funding and Reform Working Group, as I just mentioned before, and then the recommendations from the annual report from MBTC on the performance and condition of WMATA. That was released last year, and just a few of those recommendations included reforming pension and other post-benefit employment benefits to manage labor cost escalation, establishing a revised Virginia-Maryland legislative operating assistance growth cap to address concerns with the existing one, improving fare box recovery by raising fares, securing sustainable and reliable sources of dedicated revenues for operational and capital funding needs respectively, and establishing a rainy day fund at WMATA. And Mr. Chairman, I know you will go more into the technical working group and its directives in our discussion of the interim work plan momentarily, But we do have 4 meetings scheduled for this interim, including today. We are looking at September, October, and November. I believe the clerk's office has already sent out polls for those later meetings, and we'll finalize those dates in the coming weeks, I believe. Just to sum up, we are due to report to the General Assembly by the first day of session with our findings and recommendations. Mr. Edward and I will produce meeting summaries that, along with all meeting materials, will be posted online on the joint subcommittee webpage, and otherwise are here to assist the subcommittee in its work. Looking forward to working with you all, Mr. Chairman, and thank you.
Thank you for that summary of our charge. Before we get into our work plan, I did want to announce the members of the technical work group that will support our efforts. Their organizations are listed on our website, but their names were not, so I'm just going to read them out. Jason Stanford from the Northern Virginia Transportation Alliance was appointed by the Speaker as a representative of the business community, and representing Northern Virginia Transportation Authority will be Monica Backman. From the NVTC, Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, Alan Fye, who I've asked to chair the work group to convene their meetings. From DRPT, Evan Price will be a member. PRTC is going to send Bob Schneider and Philip Perella. ATU Local 689 will be sending Matt Girardi, and representing WMATA, or the Metro System, and both trains and bus, is Greg Potts, and from VRE, Mark Schofield. So they'll be able to assist us in research and technical information that'll inform our future discussions. We have a draft work plan which is before the members in your packet, and they include the presentations that we'll hear at this meeting, this July meeting, from DRPT and MVTC on public transportation funding in Virginia, and particularly how transit is funded in Northern Virginia and the growing needs. But I particularly want to call your attention to the proposed discussions for September, October, November for your input. For September, we've got transit agency long-term needs, cost containment strategies and opportunities, along with an update from the technical working group. For October, we have transit revenues, projected revenue growth from existing transit funding sources, and review of prior funding and reform studies and reports, because a lot of research has been done and we can see how that may help us. Initial discussion of potential new revenues or changed revenues. Update from the technical working group at that meeting in October as well. Then finally, at what's proposed for our final meeting of this calendar year would be focused on interim recommendation, more extensive examination of potential new revenues, final update and summary from the technical working group, and a development of interim findings and recommendations. I wanted to see if we could add to the September meeting, if it's agreeable, how peer transit agencies across the country pay for transit, particularly larger systems, and maybe an example like from somewhere like St. Louis, where they have a multi-jurisdictional funding stream similar to Metro, has 3 states or localities with DC, Maryland, and Virginia. I think that could be helpful to us. Are there other initial thoughts from members of the committee as to more topics that should be added or more research that would assist us? Not stated on here also, I should say, is the DMV Moves Commission that Delegate Sickles referred to. We have also Senator Survell and I believe Paul Smedberg are members of that commission. We'll hear about their activities so that we don't overly duplicate or see if we can find areas of agreement. But are there any other points of information or topics that people would like added at this point?
Do you need a motion for your change?
I don't think we need do we need a motion? No, I think we do that informally. But is there any other suggestions that folks have at this time?
Senator, Mr. Chairman, with your permission.
Yes, Mr. Secretary.
I'm going to digress just a little bit. I just feel compelled to say a couple things. First off, there's no question in my mind or the administration's mind or most good thinking people's minds that Metro is incredibly important to that region, Northern Virginia, DC, Maryland. It's incredibly important. It needs to be sustainable. It needs to survive. It needs to prosper. No question about that. I find myself a little bit sort of the cart before the horse here in some respects as I feel about it, because the whole discussion in the last 6 or 8 months has been we need a dedicated, sustainable source of funding. I don't understand that because we have a dedicated and sustainable source of funding. Is it enough funding? Well, that's a good question. And I would tell you that there's too much funding there. It's not in the right places and it needs to be realigned and looked at. The answer is not just more money. And yet that's sort of where we start here, is go identify 10 or 15 new funding sources to make it dedicated. Well, it's already dedicated. To make it sustainable. That is sustainable funding source. Is it enough is a question, and I think that's worthy of debate and discussion. But we sort of started with, let's go find more money. Now there's cost containment in here, I see that. But I would tell you that if you look at the statistics of Metro over the last 10 or 15 years, as we've done in detail and shared with many here, and would like to continue to do that, they've got an operations and escalating cost containment issue and lots of other issues. We've been clear that we've expressed a lot of confidence in new management, and we were working with them to move forward on some of these strategies. But at the end of the day, we don't think it's in the best interest of the Commonwealth or its taxpayers just to find new money. And I know that's not your vision either, Mr. Chairman, but it's sort of where we're starting. Let's go find some new money to make it dedicated. So I'd like to ask the question differently, which is, how much money does WMATA need to fund itself from its funders to provide what we want them to provide? And first you have to sort of work both of those to the middle because you only have so much money and you only got so much you can give. And so what should WMATA look like? How can we get it to look like that? What does it cost? And then if we don't have enough money in the system, yeah, what other levers might we want to pull on to generate that money? But, and listen, I'm just a member of your study committee, sir, and I'm going to participate appropriately and properly, and we're going to support this. I just think it's important to start, from my perspective, with those comments. Extremely important to Northern Virginia, Maryland, and DC, extremely. Full support of it as a metro system. But we think there needs to be substantial changes to how it's financially operated in order to make it sustainable for the citizens who have to pay for it. And so that would be my 2 cents, sir, to start with.
Well, it's appreciated, and I appreciate all your comments. I think perhaps we can consider at our next meeting. The question I jotted down that you posed was how much money does WMATA need to be adequately funded, and also the word realignment. Would you want to elaborate at a future meeting or just hear from Metro on their...
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I mean, I'd be happy to weigh in. My staff is happy to participate. You know, listen, if you look at the ridership over 10 or 12 years, pre-COVID, don't forget COVID, if you sort of look at the cost over that same period of time, and you look at, I can give you data after data after data, which we've shared with WMATA and Mr. Clark and company, those aren't the problems. The problems that we're addressing here are intractable to how the operation is. And if we're going to just leave it the way it is, then you're just going to keep looking for sources of new income, new revenue. And I don't think that's the answer. So yes, sir, happy to fully engage, happy to share my work and our work going on continuously and before now to this committee and others. We just want to get it right, sir, and do it for as least cost as we can.
One possibility for our next meeting is we can ask Metro to present to us about how much money they need to be adequately funded, but perhaps we could talk offline after this meeting, get a series of questions that we could ask Metro to try and address in the presentation, and then at the next meeting you could
Yes, sir,
drill down a bit if needed. The one comment you made, though, you talked about Metro being important to the region of Northern Virginia and D.C. and Maryland. I would contend, and there are studies on this, there's a tremendous economic value just to the whole Commonwealth of Metro from, the corporate headquarters and so forth that we have been attracting, and the tax revenue that's generated from the vicinity close to Metro Station. So I think it's an asset not just to Nova, but the whole state.
I would say, Mr. Chairman, to emphasize your point, Northern Virginia is critically important to Virginia. So something that's critically important to Northern Virginia is critically important to the entire Commonwealth. Yes, sir, absolutely.
Thank you. Are there other comments about the work plan or thoughts to Mr. Alcorn? And then we'll go online. We'll recognize Senator Surville next after Mr. Alcorn.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A couple suggestions. One, I think it's important that for the transit agency, not just the long-term needs, but if we could also get a sense of the current needs associated with transit in Northern Virginia, I think that's important. And it relates a little bit, I think, to what Secretary Miller was talking about. Currently, we are putting a significant amount of resources into our transit systems in Northern Virginia, in the D.C. metropolitan region. I'm not saying that's enough, but I think it's important to take a look at the current needs as well for transit. And I believe I'm the only locally elected official on this group, so I'm particularly sensitive to the half of at least the Metro subsidy that comes from local taxpayers. And to me, that alone is a good reason to have this subcommittee and look at different possible revenue sources, because I do have a concern about the burden of property taxes on local taxpayers. So I think that's something that's on my mind and something I'm thinking about. The other thing I would just point out, and I do have a suggestion on a study topic, if not September, then maybe later. I think it's also important to note that this is not limited to Metro, that we're looking at transit more broadly in Northern Virginia. And for example, with the bus system in Fairfax County, at least, the majority of riders are actually not Metro bus. They're actually connector bus riders, which is funded by. So I think let's be sure we look at that. And I think, and I found this data really insightful and useful background information. And I don't know if it's a study topic or not, but several years ago, COG put out a regional travel survey. I believe it was 2017, so it's pre-pandemic. But basically, it shows for transit users, where were people starting, where were they ending up? And then similarly, for all travel, where were people starting in Northern Virginia, where were people ending up, or in D.C. or Maryland? So I would just ask if that information, if it's been updated, if we could get that as background information, and if it's not been updated, we get just the old stuff.
Can you state the information you want to update it if it's available?
Yes, it was the MWCOG Regional Travel Survey, and I know Kate is familiar with that because I just asked her for more information the other day about it. So, but it's useful context, I think, for what we're talking about, because you can see where people are going currently, transit and otherwise, and it really does, I think, provide some context for how we're going to talk about this. Thank you.
Okay, and before we go to Mr. Surville, I made a note too, and I should have said this earlier. This includes Virginia Railway Express as well as the regional buses that you referred to. PRTC. Okay. Senator Surville was waiting online to comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, you stole my thunder on the benefit to the Commonwealth piece, and I would just note that I don't believe we would have recruited Amazon to this state, but for the fact of our metro system and to a lesser extent our VRE. And I think Metro has a huge benefit to our entire state, not just Nova. Secondly, Supervisor Alcorn stole my thunder on the bus piece. As I noted at the beginning, my quarter, the area I represent has a massive bus presence, and I believe that the bus ridership has actually recovered to pre-pandemic levels and actually exceeds pre-pandemic levels, but it's the metro trains that are the ones that are continuing to lag. But the buses are an integral part of getting people to the trains, and we need to make sure that the bus system and including the local regional buses are part of the dialogue. I would just note that when the bus systems began back in the 1930s, they were all regional buses. And then WMATA was created with a consolidation of all the local bus companies in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And it seems like our localities have then decided to seize back that local bus authority for some reason. And I'm not sure if that's something we ought to look at as to whether or not the buses all ought to be run by one entity or agency instead of having all this, whatever we have right now, 10 different bus systems, which I think in part creates the ridership issues when you have to get on and off and change fare cards and pay different ways and everything else. But to me, I think there's something to explore there. The other thing I would just note is that, at least with regard to the trains, I think a big part of this discussion has to do with the commercial property market in Northern Virginia and to a lesser extent in DC. But it's my understanding that Tyson's Corner has a 16% vacancy rate right now in terms of like 16% of the spaces on the market, but that the buildings are 60% empty. And that as those leases come up for renewal every year, that vacancy rate is going to continue to climb and climb and climb. And I think part of the solution to Metro's long-term funding and viability might also revolve around figuring out how we can attract more businesses back to the urban core in Fairfax County and to a lesser extent Loudoun. And should the state have any role in trying to do that so we can ensure that this system has sufficient riders, residential and commercial, living on it. And I know it will probably give Supervisor Alcorn and Senator Boysko a stroke, but I think a Fairfax County Conference Center casino is part of that discussion, although I'm not sure that should be part of this group. But facilitating more tourism and ridership in Northern Virginia is a big part of making Metro viable again, and I think that ought to be part of the dialogue. And then the last thing, or the two last things I would say is, core capacity is still lurking out there. I think Metro is still talking about adopting soon their vision of how they're going to resolve their core capacity downtown issue, and that the amount of money it's going to take to resolve core capacity, I think, also plays into the long-term funding solution. And the last thing I would just say to Secretary Miller is I hope the administration would give some thought if Northern Virginia's localities are all okay with a local funding source, whether the administration and the General Assembly ought to stand in the way of that. I think if all of us in Northern Virginia want to create a local funding source or revenue source, and we're good with that, should the state really get in the way, Metro has been a bargaining chip and a battle point in the legislature since 1976 when Governor Mills Godwin did the first line item veto that went to the Supreme Court. And I think a regional funding source would help alleviate those conflicts in the future.
Thank you, Senator Surville. I would say a casino conference center is beyond the scope of this committee, but your points are well taken. Attracting more businesses to the Metro corridor seems to be kind of on the edge of what our charge is, but if you have suggestions for a presenter you'd like to see for a future meeting on that topic, let me know, and we'll see if we can't fit it in, at least for context. Delegate Austin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I seem to remember about 6 to 8 years ago, we did a comparison, a peer study, a peer review with other similar Metro facilities. Could we resurrect that and take a look at where we are, our status today compared to those peers that we were back then? Just as a reflection to see.
Yeah, can you restate that? You want to see which presentation?
It was a peer review study of our operating cost of Metro.
Okay.
And at that time, it produced that we were operating efficiently with our peers. I would like to see where we are today in comparison to where they are today. And that information should be available. I think Commissioner Holcomb provided that study.
I think we can have that for our next meeting. We can ask the technical working group if it's possible to update the past figures and then and now a snapshot if things are the same, better, or worse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To that end, and to my earlier remarks, we've done a lot of work and analysis and research in my office. And I would hate for us, I'm happy to share whatever we have. If any of it's found to be incorrect, we're happy to fix it. But I'm just telling you, we've done a lot of work to the members' point, Chairman Austin's point. I'd hate to just duplicate that. So I'm happy to give you everything we've done, help integrate our staffs to share that information, whatever we can do to just bring facts to the table.
Thank
a lot
you.
Of that stuff we've already prepared.
Thank you. That's appreciated.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Were there, Senator Boysko?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things that I see that we're talking about in our meeting number 2, I think it would be important. We know that one of the largest costs with the entire transportation system is with the human beings who are driving the buses, running the trains. And I think it would be important to understand what the cost of living is in those regions. And, we're not going to be able to eliminate that. And so I think we need to be honest and upfront about what the costs are, what the needs are of the people who are working for the system, how many people we need, because I think it's an easy thing to basically say we've got to cut costs and that has a real repercussion for the people who are doing those jobs and serving our communities, as their livelihood. And I think it's an important piece that we don't want to sweep under the table.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Delegate Sickles, and I think that Paul Smedberg is online in queue after Delegate Sickles.
I just wanted to make a couple remarks. I think it was mentioned that this is a transit study, not just a WMATA study. And I think there's there may be some pay dirt there with regard to how we can make our system more efficient. As Senator Boysko was saying, we have really high fixed costs on the rail side, and it's hard to get those down. On the bus side, there's probably more efficiencies that can be gained by working together with all the systems. And just yesterday, the Washington Post had an in-depth story about Metro's review and changing of their bus routes after extensive study. And there's going to be some plus sides to that. There's going to be some efficiencies and maybe some downsides for some riders. But the transit agencies across the country have been doing that, and looks like we're doing it too in our area. But my point is that nobody's saying that there aren't further efficiencies that can be made. I think we need to look at where that can be made versus fixed costs that are really hard to cut. So I want to assure Supervisor Alcorn that I am concerned about property taxes. And that is one reason why we need a source of revenue for this, so funding of Metro does not come solely from property taxes in the future. It is the price of real estate and housing is out of control in our area. It's the biggest impediment, I think, to our future growth. And so I am very concerned about property taxes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Smedberg, are you able to speak now? I don't know if we can, if you're in the dedicated meeting room or how you're listening. Okay, I got a text, so I guess maybe he's listening in the public meeting room. So, Paul, we'll look at your comments via email if you don't mind for the future agendas and consider them. Was there anyone on this side who had a comment? Okay, so I think we're ready to move to our presentations. Our first presentation from Zach Trogdon, Acting Director of Department of Rail and Public Transit, is on public transportation funding in Virginia, kind of a bit of an overview. Welcome, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you, everybody. Okay. Yeah, it's an honor to be here with you today. Too close now. Do I need to do something? We good?
Is that okay?
All right. I'll step back a little bit, actually, which is fine. How are we going to advance do I advance on myself? Okay. With a clicker. That's all. You love that technical term. A clicker. All right. We got to get it to full screen. I have to get it to full screen. So while we do that, just by way of introduction, Zach Trogdon, Acting Director. I'm actually a native of Lynchburg, Virginia, graduate of Mary Washington College. So not a lifelong resident at this point, moved away for a little bit to do some other things, but it's great to be here trying to help solve these issues and do these things. So thank you. So we will move on very quick. I hope this can be a great start to this subcommittee's work to move the ball on this issue, that we all have been wrestling with for a while. So look forward to getting going here. By way of introduction of DRPT, perhaps many of you know, what I usually say is that DRPT is actually very unique. Most states do not have a entity that is really dedicated to public transportation and rail, and so we are very unique, and you can say I'm biased but forward-looking. So many of our states around us are very very much watching us and figuring out best practices as well. Instead of reading all this, I would just point you to certainly our vision is a connected Commonwealth with an integrated multimodal network, which is what we're working on here, and that's very important to us, that serves every person, every business, and every need. The other thing I would sort of point out here is we do work with other rail and public transportation stakeholders all over the state. We were talking a second ago, and I'll also talking about what we do. We allocate out state and federal funding through grants. We're a grant-making institution. And so, you were talking about how these things are put together. We are very decentralized. We work and we provide funding to our agencies. Some places, Maryland even, I think they run theirs is a state-operated transit system, so the bus and train sometimes. So we certainly have a decentralized system here, which can present its own challenges, but better than the alternative potentially. So there's several ways to set that up, but this is just a little bit about us. If y'all get a chance to go back and read some as we move along. So for transportation funding, it starts as a Commonwealth Transportation Fund overall, as perhaps many of you know, being in the transportation within the General Assembly. What we're looking at is the purple one there, the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund is where we start. So we get 23% of 49%. So you can do the math on that. And in 25, that was $540 million for us to allocate out to our partners and stakeholders. And that's sort of where the state funding comes from. That's just state. We do receive from the federal government through a variety of programs some what you call formula funding. This is something we're eligible for every year. It comes to us by virtue of things like population. I don't think it's income based, but there's just various demographic factors that these will be allocated to us from the federal government, and then we sometimes can choose what to do with them. Some go directly to localities. So out of these, actually, the Northern Virginia region does not use some of these. If you see 5310, 11, 5311, 5329. Northern Virginia doesn't see those because those are, some of them are for rural areas and things of that nature. So Northern Virginia may see some of the 5307 funding goes directly. By the way, these numbers are the section in the Code of Federal Regulations. You go and actually read about it. So when you get into the business, you're like, what do these numbers even mean when you're talking that type of stuff? So, but these are some things that come to the region potentially from the federal government. The state gets some, but gives them out to other entities in the state. So we don't really see the stuff that goes to Northern Virginia come through here. But there is quite a bit of federal funding for transportation as well and for transit. Other programs that can apply, and some of these will be talked about by our friends from Northern Virginia in much better detail. But these are just other things that are available through various state programs that don't come through our prioritization process at DRPT. So we maybe deal with VDOT on these or OIP and other organizations. But there can be some nice capital funding from some of these programs. But this is just for your knowledge. So if you have any questions about these as we go through, certainly we're happy to try to answer those. So, but again, many of these are in other parts of legislation. Maybe VDOT runs them, maybe OIP operates them. So just other sources of funding potentially for needs in the state. They don't come out of the Commonwealth Mass Transportation Fund, I guess, is the biggest takeaway from that. So here, getting back into, after introducing those funding sources, getting back into the Commonwealth Mass Transit Fund a little bit more in detail. As I mentioned, that produced $540 million this year from those percentages, what we call a waterfall. And so once you take that largest figure, we start allocating it out according to percentages that are in code. And so some of those come off the top if you see those things to the side, and part of that is a match for some federal money that comes to help operate WMATA as well. And so Maryland and DC also kick into that as well as the federal government. So, and then in the pie chart, you see what has gone to which entities when we hit that waterfall. So again, those percentages are set by code. We take the stuff off the top, and then you apply these percentages to it. And so as you can see, WMATA and NVTC receive 46.5%. Our state operating is critically important to our other entities around the state too. And Northern Virginia localities do get that. Like we talked about, this is not just WMATA, this is also other Northern Virginia. So other Northern Virginia transit agencies do get some of that operating in state capital and some of the other funding as well. And of course, we have a VRE specific set aside as well. So a little bit more about the statewide operating and capital funding, which are our most popular, you might say, and of course our most costly allocations at this point. The operating is simply, it's not on a reimbursement basis. It is simply, it's all determined by a prioritization process. It takes into account some ridership performance measures, financial information, and then then you take the total and we apply that formula to it and figure out what each agency should get. So it's formula driven, as it says there. It is capped. It can only be 30% of an agency's total operating expenses. You see last year, and this most recent year we're in, I'm sorry, it was about an average of about 24% of a transit agency's budget. So it's, it's something. It's not trying to make them whole, but it's just giving them something to go off of. A lot of local commitment still is put into these transit agencies operating. On the capital, what we really stress is state of good repair. And we also apply those funds and projects to a prioritization process so that we are getting a majority of state of good repair projects just to keep things maintained that they have already instead of pushing for expansion. So, and it does say there we kind of use a smart scale type process where again we come up with a score based on certain criteria. A lot of vehicles, mostly vehicles. So a lot of facilities are also in there. More costly facilities. So, and as it says there at the bottom, we'll go back to WMATA and VRE for a second. They have those set asides, kind of what you might call a carve out. So they don't fit into this prioritization process. They get those percentages directly without having to go through some of that. Yes, sir.
Could you elaborate when they're not eligible for merit statewide operating and capital funding? What does MERIT stand for?
Oh, MERIT stands for Making Efficient and Responsible Investments in Transit. That was back when it was first founded. We just wanted to have a catchy. Okay. It's the program, the prioritization program itself.
Yes, Secretary Miller.
We found some substantial swings in our funding system because WMATA was so outsized, impactful. When things happened there, it threw our funding off everybody else. So we said, take them out. Let's treat them separately. Let everybody else go together because it makes more sense. And let's not whipsaw all these other transit agencies across the state. So we pulled them out to help everybody.
So it's a carve out so that the smaller agencies won't be overlooked.
Exactly. Won't get overwhelmed by something that happens at WMATA that's off the normal course of events. Yes, sir. That's why we did it. Last year, I think, 2 years ago.
Yep, exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you for the question. So just to get a little more specific about how this whole...
And Mr. Chairman, what we did is we took their sort of numbers that they've been getting that they would need WMATA, and we carved all that out. And said, all right, we're going to give that to them, and all the rest of the money will go to the rest of the agencies, and that way we won't whipsaw them. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So again, just to give you some idea of the figures that we're dealing with from the last several years for what kind of operating support is going to the Northern Virginia localities and systems. Here you go. And this is operating support. So again, this is not reimbursement based. This is based on, they put it into a mixer here and it comes out according to their performance. So we do base it on their ridership performance as well as some of what they're putting into the system in terms of expenditures. So There's some years there where there was some uplifts from some federal funding and some other state funding that came in. So you might see some of those little anomalies, but just to give you an idea of the scale of the spending here. And so this year we were able to keep most people at a good place. I'll talk a little bit later about what the actual revenues are looking like, and kind of talk a little bit about that. So here's the statewide capital support. So this is they have to apply for these. Somebody could not apply for anything going forward in a year at all. That generally doesn't happen, but we see Dash did in 22. But so this all depends on how much they apply for, and of course we only have a certain amount of funds. So again, we put this in a prioritization model. Things that score a certain way, we recommend funding, and things that maybe are below that score, if we have any extra revenue left over, and if it's a good project, we'll put it towards that. So again, just the application-based project process. This is what you see just from the last several years, what perhaps some of the Northern Virginia localities and systems received for capital through the capital program. We've talked about WMATA and VRE. So just to give you an idea of, as the Secretary was talking about VRE, we kind of looked at them and said, well, if anybody had seen a change, you might say, from the pandemic, it was, ridership drop of 90% overnight, literally overnight. So we just kind of looked at everything, as the Secretary was saying, and said, well, to give them that support that won't be so wildly swinging, let's see what we can come up with. So that's been a couple of years. We've got that little carve out for VRE at 3.5%. You can see what that amounted to in fiscal year 25 as well. And then the CROC fund, which is something else that goes to more regional funding source than the merit program, but also something that goes towards helping VRE. So then back to WMATA. This isn't as spaghetti as Kate's used to have a chart that was quite fun to get through, if you all remember that. But this doesn't quite give you everything, but you can ask some questions. So you see what we provided to WMATA this year through these various sources. I talked a little bit about them before. The $50 million for the PRIA match, the 46.5, as you see there in the middle, which equated to $217 million. And then the WMATA Capital Fund, which I think Alan File will go into maybe a little more when it comes to those are regional funds, I believe. And so that's something that was legislative years ago. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, the source of the state recurring contributions to WMATA, is some of that include the money the regional fuels tax collected in the PRTC and MVTC area? Or is that all money that's come from what does that come from, the Transportation Trust Fund, or?
Which one in particular?
It says it's a total of $421 million.
Right.
I was wondering if that included gas tax that's collected from people in Northern Virginia.
It doesn't? Okay.
No, Mr. Chair, the regional gas tax is a separate and apart from.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Sure. And so then this year, as we were kind of alluding to before, there's been some general fund monies from the legislature, so those are included as a one-time, two-time, for 2 years in the biennial budget. So, and so that's how that's at least the scale again of what you can expect to get from the WMATA funding right now that's coming through our program. So this is what I was just alluding to a second ago, is to kind of show you what we believe is the look ahead for revenues over the 6-year period of our plan right now. Gas taxes are what they are, with sometimes more fuel efficient vehicles and electric vehicles and such. So we're not projecting tremendous growth, and so that's been a challenge with some of the ways that operating costs have been increasing for all of our transit operators and just businesses in general. So that's kind of the story there. And so that's, you all were alluding to the fact that that's sort of what we're facing as well in some degrees. And then so that's really ours. So hopefully that was a good, an overview. You can kind of know what the playing field is right now. And
Secretary Miller,
can you go back a slide, Mr. Trotter?
Yes.
So I think it's important when we look on this slide, and I think Senator Servals and others' points about this isn't all about WMATA, because it's not. It's about an integrated system there, but WMATA is the big elephant. The WMATA allocation is the operating one. So when, like this year, without the special funding, I'll call it, we're at $421 million of state aid going in. That $421 million is comprised of 217 that would be the WMATA allocation, but there's still $421 million. Then the other 60, so this year will be a total of $481 million that would go into the operating and capital side of WMATA from direct state monies. And that's sort of tracked along. 2 years ago, we got almost to 600 because of some anomalies that have resulted in some trust fund balances remaining in MVGC. But in any case, what I want to sort of keep our focus on is that there's these numbers of WMATA allocation are just the operating line, but there's another $204 million of capital that goes in. Now, I will say this, Mr. Chairman, and I think it's important. We talked about sustainable funding. One of the issues that is obvious here is that when we talk about WMATA, and it's not just WMATA, it's other transportation entities, is that their inflation is much higher than inflation in general, and certainly wage inflation. And so their costs are going up faster than our revenues are going up to keep up with them. And so we certainly understand that. And in Virginia, those $204 million, $204.5 million, I think it is a fixed number. So 10 years from now, it's going to be $204.5 million. And 20 years from now, it's going to be $204.5 million. And inflation does have an impact on that. So while the others rise with revenues, the capital numbers do not. They're fixed. And I think that we should just keep an eye on that as we go forward in our discussions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions for Mr. Trogdon?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Delegate McClure.
Yes, on slide 2 of your presentation, you talk about conducting statewide rail and transit studies. So I wonder if you can talk about any studies around the growing needs to update and improve service and access to seniors and folks with disabilities, and then also how you integrate that into your allocation of funding decisions.
So we had a couple years ago done a couple years ago before I was even with DRPT, the Transit Equity and Modernization Study, and we're still implementing some of those, and that dealt some with folks with disabilities and seniors and things like that. We have a specific program. If you saw when we look at these federal things, 5310 is specifically targeted toward paratransit funding, and so we do run a program and take in applications for funding assistance just for that, and then we're very involved in that space. Other studies about that, I don't know that we've really done beyond that Transit Equity and Modernization Study, but if there's ever a desire for that, we certainly our ears are open if there's something we can do within the state to do that.
And I know Senator Surville is waiting in the queue with a question. Senator.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I just had a quick question for DRPT. As I mentioned a minute ago, in 1976, there was litigation between the governor's office, I think, and the General Assembly over a metro allocation of, I think, about $10 million for capital funding. And I know it's, for purposes of this discussion, we're mainly looking at what's happened in the last couple of years and some prospective stuff, but I also find history to be rather instructive. Are you aware of any records and materials within DRPT that talk about sort of what the history of funding support is and how it's changed over time? Because it's my impression, looking at the case from 1976, the state, $10 million for capital money was a lot more money back then than it is today. And I'm just sort of curious how involved the state has been. It seems to me in the past the state might have been even more involved than it is than today. I'm just curious whether you have any documents or information that talk about that history.
There may be something. What I can say is that DRPT was not created until 1992, so I don't know if that'll mean that we may not have anything in our archives, but I'm certainly happy to ask the questions and see if we can find anything about that litigation from 1976, you say, $10 million?
Yeah, but I'm not so curious about the litigation as I am the level of support.
Oh, okay.
There have been battles going on between Northern Virginia and the rest of the state about funding Metro for a long time, and the state has funded Metro for a long time because it was seen as a state priority. And I was just curious about that history and how long it had been going on and what levels it had been at, and what kinds of things the state funded. So
I'm happy to look. I think our records back to the 90s will probably be more available, but I don't know about back to 76, but happy to see what we can find.
thanks.
Okay, Delegate Sickles.
Yeah, just curious if you could characterize how Virginia overall supports transit versus our partners in Maryland and D.C. I know Maryland has some severe financial issues right now, just in government generally, but could you just compare and contrast a little bit and what we need to do as partners in this system, on the WMATA system?
Yeah, I think, as you said, I think a lot of it's going to be anecdotal. I think just what you said, that we feel like we're doing it in a sustainable way, and we've certainly, just in the past few years, have tried to step up when asked, even before I was here. I mean, the other anecdotal evidence I can talk to you about is I talk to people from North Carolina and Tennessee as well, and they really try to emulate what Virginia is doing, many of our programs about how we fund transit, and the fact that we use a prioritization process, and we are really putting investments into into the right things and in terms of keeping systems up. So, yeah, more anecdotal than anything, just seeing the investments we made over the years and having the ability to make this sort of bridge investment in WMATA, I guess, so that we can try to all together try to figure out how to crack this code over the next couple of years. Hopefully speaks to our ability to have that ability during that time. So, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Delegate Sickles.
Just, can you be, my little button's not working. Can you be a little bit more specific with regard to the problem we face right now?
Right.
And what DC has in its issues and what Maryland has that it's facing and what we have in our situation, and ideas on how to get from point A, where we're starting today, to, let's say, point Z, where we finish up. Just ideas. And if you can't, it's a hard question.
Yeah.
You can get back to us on that, I guess.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah. I think we could do some research on that, I think, to really,
Secretary Miller.
We'd be happy to give you some thoughts on that. We tend to be more focused on what we are doing and how to do it very well, as opposed to what our colleagues may or may not be doing as well. But certainly we're integrated up there and we need to work hand in glove with each other, and certainly we understand that. But if you've got some more specific info, I'd be happy to dig into it.
Delegate Sickles, I think our partners from Northern Virginia might have a pretty good idea about that too. We work closely with them doing the revenue reform study and all that, so they might have some ideas.
Okay. I know that I got a text from Paul Smedberg, who's listening in, and he mentioned that WMATA has some of the information that people have asked for, and he was suggesting, this is a little non sequitur, that we get a brief update at a future meeting on what's going on in D.C. and Maryland for our background. Not that we're going to do the same thing, but ultimately the system is a compact where people put in the same, I don't know what the word is, according to the formula, contribute.
Right.
And that D.C. has some kind of placeholder for a dedicated tax in their 26 budget, only if Maryland and Virginia do something. And Maryland has their own blue ribbon panel working on it. And as I mentioned, there's the whole DMV Moves initiative, which is more regional through COG that Delegate Sickles, Senator Survell, and Mr. Smedberg sit on. So we'll look forward to that in the future, getting more information on that in a future meeting. Are there any other questions for this presenter? Okay. Mr. Trogdon, thank you, and thanks for stepping up to the acting role. I appreciate you being here and the presentation.
Yeah, and certainly reach out to us if you have any questions, and we'll be happy to. We're working through the Secretary's office to help you all as much as we can.
We will. Thank you. Our next presentation is from Alan Fye, the Director of Programs and Policy at the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. Alan, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy to be here. While the slides are coming up, I just want to thank you for this opportunity to present in front of you and dive a little bit deeper into how transit is funded in Northern Virginia. Director Trogdon provided a lot of really good overview from the state level. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into the member jurisdictions up in Northern Virginia, how we fund things. So first I'm going to step back a little bit about MVTC. If folks don't know who MVTC is, talk about some work we've done. Actually, the numbers have been cited a couple times already about the value of transit to the Commonwealth. Got a little bit of information about transit budgets, how we fund it in Northern Virginia, then start that conversation on those growing needs, and then some of the work that MVTC is doing to ensure coordination between MVTC, this, and other efforts going on. So MVTC is we were created in actually 60 years ago. This is our 60th anniversary year, so we were created in 1964. We've been around for that since then, founding member of Metro to represent Metro as they were being created. Some of the first planners worked at MVTC to get Metro off the ground and up and running. We obviously oversee a significant amount of state aid that Mr. Trogdon talked about that comes to MVTC, some of those carve-outs that come there, different revenue fundings merit. The gas tax is collected in the MVTC district, sits at MVTC, and we're represented by a combination of folks from all the elected boards from the General Assembly, but as well as all of our 3 cities and 3 counties, one of which is Mr. Alcorn. So I want to step back a little bit of what does transit look like in Northern Virginia? We have a lot of different agencies that are there. We have 8 agencies that are operating there right now. We have Metro, Metro Bus, all of our local systems, PRTC, OmniRide provides service from the PRTC district in Prince William County up into Northern Virginia and into DC. So the work they do completely ties into our network. We also have Metro Rail, and we have VRE. So some stats up there from a nifty little dashboard that we have in-house at MVTC, pulling these data together. It gets updated every couple months, so these numbers are up to date. A lot of jobs up there, a lot of households up there. Right now, there's one number over there that says 8% of public transit commuters. That's an opportunity we see, and I think you'll hear that going forward. It's like, how do you get more folks onto transit? I think that's definitely something as we go forward. I wanted to talk a little bit about ridership because that comes up on a pretty regular basis. I mean, we saw the pandemic really hit hard. It hit hard on everybody. So this is 2 ways to look at this. We have all of the transit providers on the top graph. There's a lot of data up there, but focus on the visual of how it's going up. Every single one of those years is going up. So you can see those 1 years where it drops really low. That's the pandemic. It hit Metro Rail very hard. It hit VRE really hard. It hit our bus systems really hard. But they are all on the process of recovering at different speeds. Some folks have already mentioned buses come back really strong, but it's come back a little bit different. And Metro Rail is on the way of coming back, but it's coming back a little bit different. And we're going to talk a little bit later about what's different after the pandemic and how has it fundamentally changed transit in Northern Virginia, and I would say transit across the entire United States. This has already been talked about a couple times. Like, well, you covered a lot of territory that I was going to cover here, so I can just go through this pretty quickly. Investing in transit in Northern Virginia does have a direct benefit to the Commonwealth. This is our study that's been out there since 2023. We're looking at $20-25. When we look at it, $1.5 billion of income and sales tax to the Commonwealth General Fund every year. That is an investment that comes down to Richmond and gets spread across the entire state. So when folks on this dais talk about, yes, the vested interests of transit investing in it, there is truly a benefit to the entire Commonwealth. It's a good return on investment as well. For every dollar we put into transit, you get that dollar back and another $1.60 of economic impact. So this slide right here is focusing primarily just on the benefits of the Commonwealth. This doesn't even get into the amount of revenue when it comes to local jurisdictions and their property taxes and development around metro stations. So that's in addition to, but this is the Commonwealth's benefit. We spent a little bit of time figuring out, like, well, what would the world in Northern Virginia look like without transit? If we didn't have the great transit network we had there, the amount of traffic and the amount of new trips every day would be gridlock, practically speaking. 278,000 new vehicle trips a day, 1.8 million more miles every day. Come to Northern Virginia, we drive around in it, we live in it. It's a lot of traffic already. Traffic's come back worse post-pandemic, but dealing with that and how can transit help us solve that problem? I think one of our favorite graphics that people really respond to, you line up those 278,000 cars bumper to bumper, and it was stretched from New York City to Chicago. There's that many more cars moving through the traffic network in Northern Virginia. So that's if we didn't have transit. So basically, the transit benefit is significantly beneficial to us up there in Northern Virginia and the entire Commonwealth. With transit, these are some of the benefits you get. It supports jobs, supports households. Greenhouse gas emissions are removed. The operating cost of owning a vehicle is sometimes an option for folks in Northern Virginia to live with just one vehicle instead of two. That's money savings, that's money back in customers' pockets. Also avoiding serious injuries. Transit is one of the safest ways to travel in Northern Virginia, so being on transit is safe and avoiding some of those injuries and challenges that happen over time. Now, the previous slides focused on Northern Virginia and the MVTC district. This is a study that Metro actually just recently released, I would say in the last month or so, looking at the benefits of WMATA to the entire region. Some of the same themes. You see the same themes are there about property values and the amount of land and jobs and the amount of money that can be saved and what transit means to the economy in the greater DC area. I think one thing that kind of sticks out in a lot of places is how much more parking you would need with all those cars. And this example they put out there is like, we'd have to build a 5-story parking garage over the entirety of the National Mall to accommodate all that traffic and all that parking if we didn't have a transit system that moved you into the DC, that moved you around the network and got you there in a safe and reliable way. So we have a link there we're happy to share with folks. It's got really a lot more information about telling the story of transit. I want to step back a little bit and talk a little more granular. We're going to go a little bit down in the weeds now, talking about the elements of a transit budget. A lot of folks may know this here. There are two primary elements of it, an operating budget and a capital budget. The operating budget, those are the day-to-day expenses of, those are our drivers, the maintenance folks, people that run the system on a daily basis, the planners, the people that operate the system. And I think the normal number is roughly 75% of your operating budget is that labor cost. It's really important because without that labor, transit does not exist and cannot operate. The other side of the budget is the capital budget. We know that's, we've talked a little bit about that. That is buying buses, it's buying rail cars, it's maintaining those buses. It's building that infrastructure out. It's very costly to do, especially in Northern Virginia. So there are just two kind of key parts of this we talk about as we go forward. This is going to feed into some of the examples as we talk through different flavors of money. So how is transit funded?
Can we pause just for a second? This might, I don't know if this is a simple question or a complicated question, but you detailed the operating budget and the capital budget. And I was just wondering, in terms of the problem of funding or adequate funding or keeping pace with the needs, is the operating budget, due to the decreased pandemic ridership, the more significant problem, or they both equally need to be addressed?
I would say they both equally need to be addressed. I'm going to get in a little more detail a little bit further on, but yes, operating and capital both have challenges. The ridership element definitely hits a little bit heavier on the operating side, though.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Secretary Miller.
I would submit to you that the pandemic isn't the problem here, sir, with due respect. The pandemic was incredibly impactful, but we've been on a 10-year decline in ridership on WMATA as we have expanded. 10 years, all right? So in 2010, we had about 25 million riders a month, right? And we've been expanding since 2010, adding lots of service, or some service. We've had very little fare increase over that period. And before the pandemic, we were at 21 million riders a month. So we're down from 24 over 10 years, 24 and a half down to 21. We hit the bottom during the pandemic, no question about it. And now we're back up to about 15 million a month. So we're down from 24 to 15. We've made up a lot of the pandemic. We went from 21 to 15, so we've made up a bunch of it. But if you look at the fares, in terms of the impact, the fare, if we captured those fares, we'd still be in the same boat we're in because the fares are relatively low. And if you look at the impact of that revenue on the entire system as a percent of its funding, it's substantially low. And I will tell you that on the bus side of this, which is important, In the last quarter of last year, or third quarter last year, the collection rate was almost non-existent on the buses. And the answer was, well, some people were fare evading, and a bunch of the boxes on the buses don't work. So when you go to tap them, they don't work. But the numbers were huge. I'm happy to produce the data. It's on the websites of WMATA. And we're still having that in many of our hard metro rail stops in the system, where we have 68 and 75% fare evasion. And the fare, having said that, the fares are relatively low, Mr. Chairman. And if you just look at the fare revenue, even if we made that up, we'd still be sitting here. So there's a combination of things that need to happen there, but I think it's important to recognize this is not a problem that was created solely by the pandemic. It's been going on for 10 years, and we need to figure it out. But if we just focus on what happened in the pandemic, I'm afraid we're going to lose that picture. And to Delegate Sickles' point earlier, or Senator Serval, both, I think, going back to 1976, I don't know how to go back that far, but I've gone back fairly far, and we've just seen a continual decline in the ridership. So something's going on there, right? And it's not pandemic.
Yes, thank you. I don't mean to suggest that the pandemic alone, but clearly ridership was significantly down during the pandemic.
100%.
And on rail, the charts we're seeing show that the
went to zero almost.
Ridership is not up to the rail. The buses, I think Senator Serval noted, that bus ridership is surpassing pre-pandemic, but rail is not yet there. And
yes, sir.
That is a problem. I don't mean to represent it's the entire
100%,
problem.
sir.
Yeah.
100%. And we would tell you that a lot of that is the federal rail participation, the federal employee participation. If you look at them, they're the ones that they've left in such a large percentage. And at the end of the day, this system was built around those folks. Mm-hmm. This system was created and built to bring people into Center City, D.C. to work for the federal government. That's why it was created.
Yeah.
And they're not there. So that's a big part of the problem. I didn't mean to take your time, sir.
No, that's fine. Supervisor Alcorn?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I would ask if, I don't know if it's Metro or NVTC could maybe pull together some data. Basically, I think Secretary Miller raised some points. I know there were some other things going on during that period. For example, the last time I think the state was involved in a financial crisis with Metro, it was the capital funding only. And that was because, frankly, the system wasn't working that well. I was riding it then.
As well as it could have been.
Exactly, and ridership was down. It was down significantly because of that. But I'd really love to get basically NVTC or Metro's take on that and get a little bit more context for what ridership's been doing over the last decade and a half.
I think we can ask Metro at a future meeting to talk about ridership.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
And Metro can also tell us how they've reduced fare evasion substantially, they say almost completely, and they might tell us about how they just raised the fares on the system. And so some of this stuff that the Secretary is saying needs to be done is being done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
In regard to that, I think
yeah, Mr. Chair, and they can correct me if I'm
sorry, Delegate McClure.
They can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe fare evasion was down 70% last I checked.
Thank you. Okay. Back to you, Mr. Fry.
All right. Thank you. All right. So talk a little bit about how how transit is funded in Northern Virginia. We've talked about this network, the great, amazing network we have up there, but it costs a lot of money to pay for it, and it's complicated. I think that's one of the things that I think folks in the room and a lot of staff folks completely understand. There's a lot of elements that go into it. There's a lot of different things you have to balance. Mr. Trogdon started talking to us a little bit about different elements of the different pots of money that are available from the state, from local, from regional, from federal. These are just some of the considerations that people really have to think about, our local agencies think about when they're coming up with their budget. And all of our local jurisdictions do the same process to look up where do you find the best money, because the conversation about property taxes has come up several times at METC as not being the only source. So the idea is to leverage these other different pots of funding from across the federal, state, and local levels. So it's complex. There's a lot of work that goes into this. It doesn't look like it's very complicated, but those are just some of the high-level buckets we kind of bucketed things into, but a lot of strategic work goes into it. Basically, as everybody's trying to put together their budget, they're trying to match all those things up. And this is a very, very high-level snapshot of some of the sources that do exist in Northern Virginia. As you can see, you can't always use every type of funding for every type of expense. So it is a strategic effort to match up all the different types of monies that go in different places. Some of them are very flexible and cover a lot of things. Some of them are very restricted. Federal formula money goes to capital, for example, can't be used for operating, can only be used for capital. At the same time, MVTA, the authority, can only be used for capital expansion. Local money is the most flexible. So putting all these together as they're building their budgets out to try to figure out how to best pay for transit is a challenge going forward. So the idea is to strategically match the right pot of money with the right expense. And dedicated funding is out there as well. There's multiple, existing dedicated sources we'll talk about as well. And this is one of our favorite graphics that we have at MVTC because it kind of dives into, and it gets referenced a lot, how the different money flows in different ways. So we have money that comes from the Commonwealth on the purple side up there. We have the WMATA allocation that comes that Mr. Trogan talked about. The allocation that comes to MVTC. There's the PREA match, which comes off the top that matches DC, Maryland, and federal money. The capital fund, I think it's important to know the capital fund is one of the dedicated capital funds, really important. 80% of that is generated in the MVTC district. So it's really important, and there's local match as well that goes in there. So the state is definitely a very solid partner when it comes to funding Metro. The other part we have the gas tax that sits at MVTC, the regional gas tax, which can be used for capital and operating. The state aid that comes down from the Commonwealth is used for capital and operating. Then you mix that together strategically with the different pots of money that our local jurisdictions, again, some of the examples from the earlier slide in here, each of our 6 member jurisdictions pull those together and figure out how exactly they're going to pay that Metro bill every single year. Now, except for the WMATA Capital Fund, which is strictly capital, and PREA is strictly capital, the other ones do have the flexibility of when folks are paying their Metro bill, whether it's their capital or operating budgets. That's very strategic about how they pull those dollars together.
When I'm looking at your slide on 18, it shows the capital fund with the arrow coming off the compact funding jurisdictions going to the capital fund. Is that what that's showing me? The gray arrow?
Yes.
So you're saying that WMATA Capital Fund, the Virginia share of the regional dedicated funding is coming off of MVTC from the gas taxes. That's what we were.
Correct. There's multiple elements that flow from the local jurisdiction that flow into the capital fund, which is then matched with other state sources and MVTC district sources that then goes to Metro.
So are you including the 150 million, 154 million? Where's that coming in here?
That is the WMATA dedicated fund. The WMATA Capital Fund on the very right-hand side. Yeah. That is the $154 million dedicated capital, Virginia's element of it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Great. So one of the important elements of things that we do at MVTC is managing that state aid that comes from the carve-out that Mr. Trogan spoke about earlier. That money comes down to MVTC and sits in a trust fund on behalf of all of our jurisdictions. Now, there are multiple funds that can go in there. We get the WMATA capital and operating funds, that's the state aid. There's transit operating funds that come to each one of the individual jurisdictions. Again, that merit program, then capital funds. TRIP project, that's a transit ridership incentive program that the General Assembly created a couple years ago. If any of our jurisdictions are awarded that funding, they flow through it as well. And also sitting in there is a regional gas tax and then any interest that's accrued by the money sitting there as it's going in and out. So that's a snapshot of what's in the trust fund. There's a lot of work that MVTC does to strategically manage that with all of our jurisdictions as they're making those really, really important investments into their local transit network and Metro. So some of the key funding takeaways, obviously we talked a lot about investing in Northern Virginia transit benefits. The Commonwealth transit agencies are really focused on maintaining their existing infrastructure and their existing service. There's sometimes can be a disconnect between the different programs that are out there. Some may focus more heavily on expansion when maybe the bigger need is state of good repair and keeping the service we have today. So working through some of those nuances. The existing funding sources generally aren't keeping pace with growing costs and needs, and I think that's where a lot of the discussion going forward is going to focus on. What is that disconnect and what is the delta between those two? Inflation obviously has a very big impact. A lot of these factors are they're outside of agencies' control. Virtually every industry and virtually every single level of government has dealt with the inflationary impacts. Some of the local fiscal tools are limited, and for folks that have sat on local government, transit competes with other needs. There are priorities for safety, for schools, for hospitals, for all those types of things. So transit, when you look at in the local budget, it's competing in a lot of different ways to get that necessary investment. I think it's important to realize, we're going to talk about this a couple times, it's come up a few times already, is with the DMV Moves effort, funding the metro side of the conversation. It is part of a larger regional conversation with Maryland, D.C., and the federal government. I think that forum is going to come up many, many times over the course of this effort to figure out how our colleagues in Maryland, D.C. are working with it. And again, it comes down to maintaining Northern Virginia's longstanding partnership with the Commonwealth to support transit's ongoing growth and recovery is really important because of that economic driver that transit is for the Commonwealth. Now, we've talked a little bit about this already, the growing needs, what's changed. So I tried to boil this into a little bit of a snapshot of what has changed since the pandemic. So travel patterns have changed. We've seen with bus, travel patterns are all day versus it used to be versus the peak. You had a lot of services very peak oriented because people were going into somewhere and coming back. They're commuting that 9 to 5. What we've seen since then is that pattern's change. There's a lot of people there's still some 9 to 5. I do a lot of 9 to 5 commuting, but there's also folks that they commute midday because they're only going to be in the office half the day. There's more stuff in the evenings. People have more flexible schedules. That directly impacts how you can operate a transit system. Then 7-day a week versus work days. We've seen a significant recovery, especially on the bus side on weekends, because folks are going to work and doing their things, but when they have to live their life on the weekends, the demand for bus service has really shot up way more so than before the pandemic. Commuting is different. There's a 9 to 5 versus the flexibility. I think Secretary Miller mentioned earlier the impact of the federal workforce is, I think, we're overly sensitive to it in Northern Virginia because of the large federal workforce we have compared to most other transit agencies in the country. So we feel that impact a little bit harder, not just at Metro, but at VRE and our local services. Then the other side, I think this we'll dive into, is the cost drivers, the constraints. There are labor costs. These are negotiated labor agreements that Metro has, that some of the other transit agencies have, that they're binding legal agreements that we're required to fund. That's an important part. We talked about how big of a cost that labor is. And Senator Boysko, you mentioned the differential of costs between cost in Northern Virginia versus other parts of the state. There are still some ongoing supply chain challenges that impact costs at a Metro, the transit agency. Inflation, we're all still dealing with that. One very nuanced thing is bus manufacturer consolidation. I throw it in there because there's fewer and fewer bus constructors in the country, which means there's less capacity to get us the infrastructure we need, to get us the buses we need that can impact reliability. It's a way bigger problem in Northern Virginia, but it's one that's out there as it definitely impacts how we do things. And the expiration of federal COVID aid. A lot of the organizations are moving through that, using up the last of it, which is it has impacted how some of the conversations we're having today. I wanted to get a couple snapshots all from different other agencies. I think it's really important to understand that this is not a challenge that is unique to Northern Virginia or to Metro or to VRE. This is a nationwide challenge, that restructuring of what does transit look like in a post-pandemic world. Things changed a lot. The transit industry got hit really hard. What does it look like? What changes need to be made post-pandemic when it comes to how funding works, the types of funding, the type of service we want? All those factors play into it. So New York, Chicago, LA, just to name a few, they're all working through very, very similar challenges as we emerge from the pandemic. This goes a little bit deeper into some of the granularity, we talked about when does money fall off and where have we bought ourselves a little bit of time to work on some things. So thankfully to the work of the General Assembly, we've got 2 years of some additional investment in Metro as we work through this process, DMV moves and others, to figure out what is that long-term sustainable financial condition that we're trying to get our transit agencies into. So we basically have FY25 and 26 of that additional money. The 3% cap was temporarily waived, which gives us that flexibility to work through some of the nuances of this. But if we don't solve this and get it onto longer-term sustainable funding, we're looking at an operating fiscal cliff in FY27 for Metro. That's on the operating side. Jump down to the capital side. 2018, we've invested a significant amount of money into WMATA capital from Maryland, D.C., Virginia, the federal government. Metro has done an amazing job, I think people would agree, getting out there, spending that money, rebuilding our rail lines, rebuilding our stations, really investing that money heavily and quickly to really get our system to the point where it's much more reliable. Now, that rapid expansion, a rapid cost of doing that means eventually you're going to run out of capacity to use that money. So we're projecting, I think, in FY27-28 timeframe, the dedicated funding we all fought for in 2018 will get to the point where all the money in it will be used for debt service. There's a little bit of pay-go. Sorry.
Pause there for 1 second. I think Delegate Sickles has a question.
I wanted to ask you about on the capital funding. How much of that is state of good repair?
So for the dedicated funding, the WMATA
Is that
dedicated funding?
Well, whatever's on this chart, is that dedicated funding?
Yes.
Okay.
The dedicated funding, the intent of the dedicated funding was state of good repair. I would say, I don't know if I can give an exact number, but I say it's pretty significantly high, focused on getting the system back where it was.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to comment on that. I mean, I'm glad we're not at this point building more when we have, this is my opinion, we have so many state of good repair issues still remaining. I witness any escalator problem at certain metro stops, things like that, and elevators, escalators. Thank you, and the cleanliness and the attraction of our metro stations just generally. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Please continue.
Right. So with those massive expenditures over the last several years to start to rebuild the system, eventually we're going to run out of capacity for that because Metro floated a lot of debt to make sure they could get those investments done. So that's why we're talking about a capital cliff in FY28. That you're right, Mr. Sickles, we do have a significant amount of more state of good repair needs. You think of a transit system kind of like your car, your house. You're always fixing it, you're always repairing it, you're always maintaining it to keep it lasting for a long time. And I don't think there's ever a point where you're ever done with state of good repair because there's always things that need refreshed or renewed. So that mentality going forward, making sure that they're doing that over the next several years. I know Metro has done a little bit of work recently on what those needs look like, and I think that's probably something that makes sense for them to hopefully present to the subcommittee about. VRE. Right now, they're looking at an operating budget shortfall in FY28. I think they have a little bit of federal COVID aid left they're managing right now. And I guess, like I said, hopefully there's an opportunity for other agencies to come and talk about this as well. Our colleagues at OmniRide, I think we're kind of framing this as their fiscal cliff arrived this year. They had a very challenging budget year this year. They had to cut some service, consolidate some service. Work very closely with Prince William County to make sure they could get the best service they can out of the resources that were allocated to them. So that challenges are already experiencing that.
For those who in the room who might not be familiar with OmniRide, do you want to just describe that service?
Sure. So OmniRide is the Potomac and Rappahannock Transportation Commission. They do two things. They provide local service in Prince William County, but from the Northern Virginia MVTC district perspective, they provide commuter service from further west points in Prince William County into the core and into Northern Virginia, and then up the 395-95 corridor from as far south as Spotsylvania. Commuter service that operates primarily along express lanes and the highways. Right. The last one on here is the MTC local operators. Mr. Trogdon talked a little bit about the merit funding that is available going forward. If you look a little bit before, I think his slide started in FY25 and the numbers show going up. But before that, they were going up. There were a couple uplift years. of additional funding, thanks to the federal government, thanks to the General Assembly, some additional money for transit. Now it's kind of resetting back down and then hopefully going on that growth pattern going forward. So these are kind of, if you look at the shorter term snapshot needs. I know there are other agencies that can talk really in depth about some of those other needs that you talked about earlier, but this is kind of where we are in the timelines we're looking at over the next several years when it comes to what are the timeline that we need to do to address some of the bigger challenges that we have going forward. And the last section right here is I'll talk about what MVTC is doing. We're very much involved in a lot of the work going on around the region. Obviously, we're here today briefing you all. There's a lot of other work we've done for the last couple of years that we're happy to brief the subcommittee as necessary and on the working group as well. We're working very closely with the DMV moves, and I think that's one of the areas where there's an overlap between the subcommittee and overlap between MVTC and overlap between DMV moves to make sure that information is sharing. We work very closely with all of our local jurisdictions to make sure they're well informed and briefed, and all of our commissioners as well. And also, we also have up there the annual report on Metro. That's an annual report we do talking about some of the recommendations because we have a vested interest in making sure the Metro runs efficiently and runs as effectively as possible, and they're a good steward of public dollars. We also have the regional bus analysis work we're doing, which is really looking at a snapshot of those granular level needs for all 6 of our transit agencies and OmniRide. What do they need to maintain service today, and then what do they need to be able to grow in the future to be able to provide more and better service?
On the regional bus analysis, Senator Surville had questioned earlier or suggested that we might add efficiencies of multiple bus systems being operated as part of our work plan. Is part of that regional bus analysis going to consider whether that's the most efficient method, or is it just how the routes work together?
Part of the analysis was where can folks work together. DMV moves can look at it as well, but that study does because we're always analyzing, like, is there infrastructure that can be shared? Is there back office things that can be shared to make all of our systems more efficient? One example that comes up a lot is buying buses. How efficiently can you do that? Actually, I would say Virginia has one of the better structures in which to do that because we write off the state's contract. That makes it really easy for all of our local bus systems to purchase exactly what they need, negotiated price. It's one of those efficiency things that I think doesn't get a lot of celebration, but on the day-to-day impact is really important.
So do you know, for example, I think, Scott, Senator Surville, you had a question on virtually?
Yeah, I did.
Please speak up.
Thank you. And I appreciate you picking up what I was about to ask. Perhaps I'll ask the question a little more pointedly because I don't think you got an answer there. When I was a kid and I wanted to ride the bus to the National Airport Metro Station, which was the only one that was open when I was a child, I rode a Metro bus from my house in Fairfax County to the airport. In the mid-1980s, Fairfax and many of the other Northern Virginia localities decided they wanted to privatize the systems and do it cheaper by paying less benefits and retirement and stuff like that to the system that WMATA pays. And so they decided to start setting up their own systems. And eventually they again privatized them by using these third-party organizations like Veolia and Envy and whatever, and to try to save money. And the question that I asked a minute ago that I think Senator Evan was following up on is whether or not NVTC has ever looked at whether having 8 or 10 or 12, whatever it is, different bus systems makes any sense, and whether it might make more sense if all of the transit was run through WMATA like it was until about 1980 or 1985 when it all got broken up, because there might be efficiencies surrounding that. For example, NVTC would need to coordinate so many things if you didn't have to coordinate 12 different bus systems. Have you all ever looked at that?
I think in the past we've dabbled in that a little bit. I don't think we've gotten quite to the final point is what you're asking about whether this should be consolidated or not. I know there have been conversations on our WMATA committee about looking at that cost structure. I think it came up a little bit earlier because what do those cost structures between different agencies look like? Some of our agencies are very small, have 12 buses, have very small ridership, up to 100 buses, up to 200 buses, up to several thousand buses at Metro, some of which are labor, some of which labor is not involved. So the nuances of that, I think, honestly, be challenging to have an apples-to-apples conversation. But I think if that's something that the subcommittee wanted to explore, that might be something that I think that's a really large effort to look at that. And I think we'd have to be very cautious about how exactly you define what you're comparing Northern Virginia versus the rest of the state, small agencies versus larger agencies.
Is it possible to go to the Regional Bus Analysis Task Force or working group that's ongoing now and ask, should we look at having Dash in Alexandria, ART in Arlington, the bus in Fairfax and Fairfax City and Falls Church, if it makes sense, if there's some kind of way to evaluate whether there's a potential cost saving and how big a cost saving it might be to have one bus system versus having, procurement arrangements to try and get efficiencies, the way things are with that kind of improvement versus an actual larger one system. Is that something that you could take back to that commission to see if there's an interest in that? Or Ms. Matthijs?
Would you like to?
There you go. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think there's definitely opportunities. The current work that we're doing is actually incorporating the work of our localities and then finding out where there are opportunities for overlap. So that effort is actually near wrapping up, but I think this is an important question we can bring back to the commission. One of the things it's important to understand is that our localities have identified the bus needs for their communities that may be unique to a regional system. In the work that WMATA has been doing with their Better Bus Network, and I believe one of the members here mentioned that, that is all being done within conversations of how those fit within the rest of our bus network. So I think that there are definitely always opportunities for coordination and collaboration. I think that I'd like to take this back and have a conversation with my commission who represent all of these local bus systems and see where we can explore that question.
That would be great if you could let us know at a future meeting if there's any interest or if there are any reasons not to do it. But if there is a potential savings and an interest in evaluating it, I think we'd love to know that. Thank you. Yes, Supervisor.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, on that point, I thank you for bringing that back. This is actually the main reason I wanted to request that MWCOG regional travel survey from several years ago, because it does show how many transit trips are, at least across jurisdictions, in regional that way, how many are within jurisdictions, and then, of course, the overall number of trips, whether transit or otherwise, because I think that's important background information. And also, I think it's important to note, and we'll hear this later, that there is a difference in regional bus and local bus. And I think that's one of the nuances, I think, when we have this discussion that I know at NVTC we talk about, but probably here too. I'm not sure where it ends up, but I would welcome the conversation.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Secretary.
Mr. Fry, thank you very much. Great info. And I agree, Mr. Chairman, that it makes a lot of sense to continue to look at that integration in Northern Virginia, because you do have a lot of operators, sort of. And I don't know what the right answer is, but certainly bears looking at, I believe. If I told you the average number of people at any one time on a 50-passenger bus was 9, is that a good number? What would you do with that if I told you that? Would you question why you had 55-passenger buses for 9 people? Would you do that? And I mean, I would, right? I mean, I don't have a Suburban when I'm the only one in the car. Or I don't buy a 10-passenger seat golf cart if I'm riding by myself all the time. So I would ask that. And then my next question would be, do we have any sense for that? As we do this analysis, as we do this work, how many people would be on the bus at any given time on average? You could break it up by peak time, non-peak time, whatever. And to me, that's just so fundamental. You know, do we have, and I know we have problems buying buses, and I know we're trying to buy electric buses now, and there's even more problems. I heard a comment, and listen, I'm all for electric vehicles if they make sense. I'm all for them. One of the senior leaders at Dominion told us the other day in a presentation, the electric bus battery is 30,000 pounds. Okay, 30,000 pounds. Do you know what that does to the road? I'll tell you what it does to the road. Second, it takes the power that powers the Monroe building for a day to give that bus one charge. And that's neither good nor bad. It just is a big number, right? It's just, wow. And the problem becomes, of course, is do we have enough electricity to do that? Can we get it to where the bus is? Can we buy the bus for the right number, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But at the end of the day, we keep riding around buses in my community that we wrap with pretty things that we advertise to get some revenue. And you can't see many people on the buses, but you get on, and there are very few, right? And there have been very few at any one time. And I just say, whether it's the metro, whether it's the bus, whether it's, if I ran I won't get into the ferries, but whatever I'm riding, I got to make some sense of it. And sometimes it just needs to ride no matter what happens, right? If you've got something that's just emergency based, it's got to keep going, right? You got to be able to get where you're going. But I question that, right? I question that. And when I ask people in the industry, how many people on average are on your bus at any one time, you know what they say? They don't have an answer. And to me, that's just so fundamental. And it's not about the right route or the right trips or how many times I go. It's just my vehicles are often too big and they cost more. But in any case, I digress. All these things are critical because we're paying money for drivers and routes and buses and so forth. And we ought to know something as fundamental as how many people get on a bus. And I would tell you we don't really track it very well.
I guess just to put a point on the Secretary's question, do we know if our regional bus systems are tracking how many riders are on average at a given point in time?
I can double check with them, but I know most of them, they definitely track ridership on a daily basis, if not a weekly basis. I can follow up and see if we can find any more granularity.
Maybe you could ask that group just if there's a way to get that kind of data of whether it's at any one moment or an average kind of ridership that would be of interest. Thank you.
All right. I got one more. Sorry. So I talked a little bit about our annual report, then I'll wrap up here. Basically, I think some of this already came up, but I just think it's a really important time to revisit some of it. Is like, when it comes to talking about the work that we're doing going forward, work that we're doing at Metro. We got that additional funding for Metro over the next 2 years, suspended the cap, which helps us, gives that breathing room. I think we had the conversation come up about raising fares for Metro Rail, Metro Bus. That did actually go into effect a couple weeks ago, so that is more revenue coming into the system. There are some other areas that Metro is going to be exploring going forward. And I think another thing here to reinforce is the conversations that MVTC is having across the river with Maryland and DC. They're happening at the elected level through DMV moves. They happen on a very regular basis at the staff level as their folks are staffing up to their elected officials on all the different regional bodies. We're very much there having those conversations behind the scenes to make sure we know what's going on in Maryland, we know what's going on in DC, and then working through some of those challenges. So the MVTC definitely takes a pride in that role of making sure that the knowledge is shared and that we're getting that information back to us so it informs our decisions. As closing up, we've talked about a lot, so I'm going to run through it again. I think I've said all of it before, but a lot of work going forward, looking forward to working on the technical working group. So thank you, Senator Eben, for the chairmanship. I appreciate it. Look forward to the work. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. And I'll note that in the back of the presentation is a little glossary that we have for those that want to make sense of alphabet soup. And appreciate it.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Were there any other questions before we let Mr. Fye sit down?
I have a question.
Senator Boysko.
Thank you. One of the things that you mentioned in your last slide around seeking a commitment from federal, state, and regional partners. We all know that the federal government benefits from having the Metro system, and they're only paying for capital expenses at this point, correct?
Correct.
Were they subsidizing the federal workers who were coming in at a significant amount, and is that a large portion of what we've lost? Or is there any other way we could get the federal government to subsidize for even just big events that happen on the mall or whatever?
So the way the federal government subsidizes, probably the best way they get money into the operating budget is through transit benefits. It's a program that all the different federal agencies have. They provide a certain dollar amount to each of their employees to use for transit. They can use it on Metro, they can use it on VRE, local bus services, but that's the incentive that the federal government gives as an employer. I know there have been some very high-level conversations about the impacts of COVID since the federal agencies are not back in the office. That lost revenue that riders would have been getting into the system is no longer there. So are there options for examining what that looks like going forward? Transit benefits, keeping that, something on top of that? I think there's some conversations that have happened at a high level with Metro, OMB, Office of Management and Budget at the federal level to think about that challenge. I think it's safe to say that's a little bit longer runway before anything like that comes to fruition, but I think there's hopefully a receptive audience about that of trying to find every different opportunity there is to find a way for the federal government to contribute to transit.
Thank you. Before we move, thank you for the presentation and thank you for your work.
Senator Evans.
Senator Servelt, did you have a question?
I have one more question. Thank you. This is a question generated by something somebody just tweeted at me. But I thought it was a good question. So, I represent Fort Belvoir, which Fairfax County tells me is the largest employer in the county. I think about 80,000 cars go on and off the base every day. And when the state did a study of I-95 a couple years ago, they said that the three largest destinations on I-95 were, I believe, the Pentagon, Arlington County, and Fort Belvoir. And as we know, the Occoquan bottleneck there is probably the most highly congested area of interstate in the entire East Coast, if not maybe the country. Is NVTC looking at, and then given that we're talking about the growing needs of transit in this committee, is NVTC looking at ways to grow transit between Prince William and Fairfax? Because I know NVTC's mission is Fairfax and all the inner stuff. PRTC looks at Prince William, but all the people trying to get into Belvoir from Prince William and not go all the way to DC is a huge driver of the congestion that we're seeing on I-95. And I'm just curious, is there anybody looking at how to expand transit like that and not just transit into DC or into Tysons or whatever?
I would say yes. The regional bus analysis we talked about does include PRTC. There are partners. We work with them very closely on a daily basis, talking about their challenges, working with them. So we have a very close, long-standing relationship with them. And any analysis we do, we always make sure they're at the table because even though they're coming from further south or further west, it directly impacts transit in the NVTC district.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. Thank you, Senator, for the question. Now we're going to move on to discussion and before we get to public comment. We had a lot of discussion about items to add to our work plan, which I'll have to try and figure out between the September and October meetings how to make that so our next meeting won't be too much of a marathon, but still be productive and informative. But are there members of the joint subcommittee who would like to make any points before we move on to public comment? Senator Boysko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, I've heard from some of my constituents who are very actively engaged in transportation funding and making certain that they have the ability to attend the meetings in person. Some of them have reached out to me and my office, and I just want to make certain that we are being as transparent and as welcoming to the public as possible as we embark on this good work.
I think I heard from some of your same constituents, perhaps, who had inquired about why the meetings were in Richmond. It's because we're the state capital. But that being said, because many of the members, or most of the members of this commission are from Northern Virginia, we are looking into holding future meetings in Northern Virginia. We have to get authorization to do that, particularly if it's on dates outside of our standard interim meeting dates. We've polled about meeting on some of those standard dates, which would be here in Richmond, but we're going to send the members another poll after we talk to Senate rules about holding the meetings possibly in Northern Virginia on different dates. So we'll look into that. But in terms of transparency, we're about to take public comment, and we do that in person at all of our meetings, and and welcome people to email our offices in the interim as well. With that said, are there members of the public who would like to come forward and add anything to our discussion before we adjourn today? Anyone in the room? Okay. Seeing none, we have a lot to digest. We will have I'll have a revised work plan to the members of the Joint Subcommittee before our next meeting. I particularly appreciate Mr. Trogdon and Mr. Fye for their presentations and the members for being here today. If there's no other business before us, the committee will adjourn.